with students. But this man is a master teacher in and of his own right. He has done the work to keep the focus of African-centeredness happening in his university. Sometimes you go into an institution and you find it Negro, but that doesn't scare you, it doesn't shock you. Even though it says it's historically black, he knows they really don't know their history. So he was there to setting the record straight, raising a department for our students to understand their origins, understand their history as well as their humanity. I want to present to you the moderator of our next panel, Dr. Kobe K.K. Kambon.
No tell, brothers and sisters. It's a distinct honor for me this morning to have been asked to introduce my young sister, Sister Valethia and Watkins Beatty. Sister Valethia, I've known her for some time, and she was a graduate student. She and her distinguished warrior husband, Brother Mario, whom we all know, we had the honor of being present at their joining together in African warriorhood in the right way. And it was such a special inspiration to see the next generation on our heels doing it the right way. So it's a special honor to be able to introduce her, and I'm not going to take up much of her time by my own preaching. But let me just say a couple of things. She got her PhD from the Department of African and African-American Studies at Temple University, they have trained some good up-and-coming scholars, particularly for ASCAC, and we certainly want to give them their due. We are so honored to have her. She's at Clark Atlanta University now and an assistant professor. And I'm sure that good things are going to come out of Atlanta, the whole Atlanta complex, now that we got, actually got some more help in Atlanta. Got a little army that we're building in Atlanta now, and some things, Atlanta's going to become, I think, what it should have been all the time, and the true leader in African-centered intellectualism. And I'm looking forward to that, and even when I retire, I may sneak in the back door up in Atlanta. But we certainly are so proud of her. You know, I've been teaching young people and interacting with them for over 25 years. And one thing that is certainly important that we must recognize is while many of our brother warriors have high profiles, not enough of our sister warriors have high profiles. And so our young girls don't always have before them the full range of African intellectual warrior women that they need before them to help them to chart their course and their destiny and their purpose so that they can find their appropriate place in this liberation struggle for our people in the numbers that they should be represented in. And so I think that it's so important that we begin to give a higher profile to our African race women. I'm particularly interested in the race women, the sisters who put the race first, and to put those women before our young girls so that they begin to see what their real destiny and purpose in life is. That we don't teach the truth about, but sometimes we present them, but we don't teach the African-centered truth about them. You know, we talk about Harriet. Most of us know about her, but they don't tell us the African-centered meaningfulness of Harriet in the substantive way that would inspire our young people to step forward, our sisters to step forward as young warriors. That she carried that gun, but we like to emphasize the Europeans who wanted to assist her. But she carried the gun to kill Europeans who wanted to interfere with her liberating African people. That's why that sister carried that gun. She put her race first. You see, that was what her significance was for us. That Yah Sanchua, the great queen mother of the Ashanti, I mean, she stood before our people and said, rise up to our men. and challenge the enemies of our people. This was a race woman. This was an African race warrior woman. And so these are sisters who put the race first. And our young girls need to know about that. You know, our boys need to know it too. But our girls need to know that so that they see that there is clearly, always has been a place for them. They've always had a place, the role has been there. We just have not emphasized it properly to our young girls. And we have the contemporary models that Sister Valethia has modeled herself after, used them as her role models. The great sister warrior race woman, Frances Cress Wilson, and the great sister race warrior of Marimba Ani. You see, she has these models. And these are the sisters that we want to elevate. Not that we are going to disregard others, but the race first women are the women we must put forward. The ones who said, I will kill and die for African people. That I love African people and African people first. And it is in that context and in that vein that I am most proud to introduce this young sister warrior who has patterned herself after these African race women warriors. So join me in please welcoming this young African race woman, this warrior in transformation, Sister Valethia Watkins Beatty.
Yim Hotep. I would like to begin by giving acknowledgement to those whose shoulders upon which we all stand, in particular our elders and our ancestors. And in that vein, let me first step back and say, may I have permission of my elders to continue to speak? I say. It is on the shoulders of our ancestors and our elders who gave us the gift of ASCAC. Those Africans who walked this walk in another historical moment, and those elders who are still with us, blazing the trail for us to follow, to listen, and to hear the words of our ancestors. To hear the words of our ancestors, but to actualize those words. Our elders and ancestors, those Africans who sacrificed and who were sacrificed in the struggle to create a path for the future generation. And it's that sacrifice that gives us this very, very important organization. And we're so, so very blessed to have the opportunity to continue to celebrate our very best in terms of our tradition. ASCAC is really important organization in the sense that when we talk about what this struggle represents, as Baba Cambone said, what it represents in terms of for the future, this clears a space for us to be African. But we're not just African on the weekend. We're struggling to be African every day of our lives. And that notion of putting race first, because the way people have conceptualized this problem of gender, I don't know how many sisters in here are African during the week and a woman on the weekend. Does anybody find the ability to split their manifestation in that sort of way? And so what I want to do is not only thank the ancestors and our elders for giving us ASCAC, I want to also acknowledge Queen Warrior Nzinga for her leadership and commitment to ASCAC, and for being a role model for the young sisters and brothers. I also want to acknowledge and thank the brothers and sisters who worked hard to present, who labored here to present us with this conference. I'm talking about the people who worked the table, who chauffeured us back and forth. We really appreciate it, if I can speak on behalf of everybody who's benefited from that hard work. I want to thank you for allowing us to experience this another 18th successful conference. And of course, I must acknowledge ASCAC has always been special to us, but now it has a deeper structure meaning for my brother, my beloved, my husband, Mario Beatty. I have to acknowledge him. And every time we come to ASCAC, our anniversary will always fall simultaneously with the meeting of ASCAC. So I want to thank this brother. I also want to acknowledge another brother who is a pillar in my life, who has been my running buddy for many years, Brother Greg Kamati Carr. And then, of course, every time you're in a situation like this and you begin to name the names, you get in trouble. Because there are so many people whose shoulders I stand on. And there are so many people in the ASCAC family through words and deed who have touched my life, who has shaped me. Because I am nothing without you. And I am standing here because as a young student, I was grabbed by the members of ASCAC and given an opportunity to grow and develop. So what I try to do is represent the best in our tradition, and I appreciate the love and support that we always are shown to continue to represent the best in that tradition. Now, I am somewhat nervous, but I know I'm with family. And so I will say, may the ancestors be pleased with our attempt to restore Ma'at to the universe, and may our victory, our total victory as a people, come all the sooner because of our struggle. Today, my topic is entitled, In the Eyes of the Beholder, Gender and the Politics of Writing African Women's History. And this title, In the Eyes of the Beholder, was inspired by a sister, a Yoruba sister who is a scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her name is Yoranki Oyewumi. And you may have heard me mention the book before, but I think it's a very important book, and it's called The Invention of Women, Making an African Sense of Western Gender Discourses. And one of the things that she makes as an assertion in that book is that gender, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And we can understand that different cultures have different standards of beauty. And we must extend that understanding that different cultures had different understandings and conceptualization of the concept of gender. In a recent article, the most recent edition of Us magazine, and that's really just them, not us, but Us magazine, they did a story about Hollywood's obsession with size. So we want to talk about beauty being in the eyes of the beholder. And since we're near Hollywood, I haven't taken a tour, but I imagine we're close to Hollywood. I think it's interesting to point out what that article was talking about. In Hollywood today, to be a size 4, 6, or 8 is to be overweight. Size 4, I don't think I've seen that since the 5th grade or something. 4, 6, or 8, you said 4 since you were 4, is overweight. Can you imagine? Now, what many actresses are doing under the pressure of the European beauty standard in Hollywood, the ideal size is a size 0. Now, how many people even knew they made a size 0? Okay, so they're giving the example. They say that is what they call the lollipop standard of beauty. Lollipop, imagine a lollipop. You have the big head or the big circle with a stick. And they give as an example people like Callista Lockhart from Ally McBeal and some other people. And that there were women who were quote unquote normal size 4 and 6 who were forced to either go down to a size 0 or lose their jobs, or in terms of not getting certain parts. And they were also talking about the extreme to which these people act against nature to achieve that. That one personal trainer talked about the fact that A woman came into him and was pointing to a body part saying, how can you help me lose this particular body part? And he said, ma'am, skeleton parts of your body, in other words, your hip bone, no matter how much you exercise, cannot be lost. All right, so different cultures have different standards of beauty. And likewise, different cultures have different understandings of the concept of gender. Why that's important to point out is because of the European mindset and the notion of cultural arrogance, which will not allow them to recognize that when it comes to male and female relationship, African people in particular did it better. Their cultural arrogance is such that they are the apex of all that is great in terms of human manifestation. All right. So everything good, whatever they consider good, democracy, this technology, this advancement, and that's debatable, that came from the unique genius of the European mind, according to them. And then when we begin to talk about those things that are evil, such as slavery and the hatred and the kind of despair and anti-black prejudice that we see and anti-black oppression and the long-range manifestation of that, that becomes human nature. That is something all humans would do is if they were in the European shoes. You see what I'm talking about with that? Good is unique to Europe, evil, well, that's everybody. Everybody would have did it. So if the shoes were reversed, you would have done the same thing to them. I say that because when we look at the standard generalizations that we have about the concept of gender and the generalizations in terms of statements that we make, we're talking about the particular experiences in some regards to Europeans. Now, of course, because of our proximity to them, we naturally experience some of the fallout of that. But I say that because we need to recognize what is them and what is us. And some of us have difficulty in separating out what is them and what is us. And this problem has to do with all of the problems we experience with miseducation and the lack of knowledge of self. Because if we had a true knowledge of ourselves, the true knowledge of the seminal role that African women have always played in the African world community, when they come with their narratives, we would say, that's your baggage. And we have enough baggage that I don't need to take your baggage on. I don't need additional load. But some of us pick up their baggage too and add their bags to what we're already dealing with. All right. Oyewumi is making a statement that gender, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, because she wants to assert that when someone goes to study gender, they're not just observing objectively, but that as they record, they construct. They create those definitions, that you cannot understand it without having a frame of reference. So that when they begin to look at certain things, and as we want to go back and build knowledge of African women in particular, and see how we acted in concert with African men to build the African civilization that we built, and to have models of how to relate as men and women, then we would be able to see it on our own terms. And it's important to lay out the foundation to begin to have a criteria to see it on our own terms. Otherwise, as we look through other people's eyes and filters, then we will misinterpret and distort what we see if we're not able to have the ability to look at it on our own term. All right. So for example, when we hear generalizations like women did not work. Women didn't work until the feminist movement liberated them from their homes and gave them an opportunity to go out and be corporate slaves and to be corporate whores. because that's what corporations want you to do. You work in the interest of the corporation. And if you choose to work in your own interest, then you choose not to work. All right? Is that the truth? If we look at our ancestors, if we look at our cultural framework, women, black women, have worked since the beginning of time. And when we talk about work, the notion that only paid labor is work becomes the first thing we need to question. But secondly, the notion that we didn't work until feminism is completely false. So then we have to say, if they say women in general, then which women are they talking about? Because not only did black women always work, and the issue is, why did we always work? And of course, people who would start our history with slavery and use that as the beginning point would begin to distort the history. Because you would say we work because we had to work, end of story. But it becomes, what is your frame of reference to determine what is normal and what is abnormal? And when people say we work because we had to work, the notion is, the normal rule is that women didn't work in terms of outside employment, and that we represent a deviation from what is normal, and that if we didn't experience racism, then we could be normal. I'm talking in terms of how people tend to think about this process. But if we have a long memory and a long history, then you understand in Africa, women worked, not because of slavery, not because of racism, because they had an important role, specific function in the social order. So it makes a difference. What is your starting point? Are we, and of course I know, and this is rhetorical for people in here, but it's important to pose for people outside of here. What is your starting point? Are we African women in America or Western women of color? Because the term women of color is a very popularized term now. But if you're a Western woman of color, then you have to borrow from the European your notions of what is normal. What are you referring to as normal, and what are you referring to as non-normal? Becomes very important, because it becomes the standard by which you judge whether or not something is good or bad, valuable or non-valuable. So when we look at, one of the standards we need to look at is not just being able to describe or point to a particular behavior or a particular act. It is, what is the function? There are several questions we need to ask when we see or describe or talk about something. What is its function in that social order? What is the value that the social order gives to that function? What is the function, and what is the value that is given to that function? And then what does it mean? So for example, myself, using my own experience, when I was about 11 or 12, my mother and my grandmother attempted to teach me how to cook. But I resisted that training. Why did I resist that training? Because for some reason, I had in my head that cooking equals oppression. So if I learned how to cook, I would have to be a servant to a man. So I figured the way not to be the servant to the man is not to cook. Now I'm 11 and 12. I had never heard the word feminism. I didn't know a feminist, but yet somehow their ideals had infiltrated my consciousness. And I have to say to my ancestor, who is my Karoo now, Mr. Pearson, who was one of my grandmother's good friend, he was so appalled when he heard me as an 11, 12-year-old say, I will never learn how to cook because I'll never be subservient to a man. And he was like, first of all, how you gonna get a man if you don't know how to cook? So I made some changes, and hopefully Mr. Pearson is aware of all those changes, and he can see I have a better life now. But the reason the cooking was so important is because when I went off to law school and my mother wasn't there and my grandmother wasn't there, I wanted some good food. And I was not equipped to cook for myself. I used to catch the bus to the Kmart where black sisters, older women, were in the Kmart cooking macaroni and cheese, which I thought was the hardest dish. Now I'm an expert at it. And I catch a long bus ride to learn how to cook. So cooking in and of itself does not mean oppression. And as we look at the condition of our children today, cooking is one of the most essential and vital functions in human existence, providing food, basic. And we have the health problems in our community because many of us have turned that function over to corporate America, McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, pure poison. We look at the effect on the bodies of our young girls who have begun to mature sooner because of the drugs they put in. And so it's not a notion of, I'm up here saying, women, you just have to cook. It is, what is that function, and then how does a society organize it to be done in the most efficient and effective way? All right? So that becomes the issue, not that I'm not going to do it because it's oppressive, and you're not going to do it because it's oppressive. And you go to any food court, you see all the single men lined up to get their meal. Some men used to marry a woman just because she cooked so great and he wanted a good meal. Now that's not good per se, but it did keep families together. And it gave people incentives. What I want to start with is the concept of gender, because it is a term that we take its meaning to be self-evident, and we take it for granted in terms of what it means. I'm sure if I said gender, most of you already know the answer as to what it means. There's a book called The Gender Agenda by Dale O'Leary. And what that author argues is that feminists, without fanfare, without a public meeting, without your input, they seized that word and they populated that word and then diffused it such that it has now come to supplant the word sex. If you go to a period prior to 1970s, people didn't use the word gender, you use the word sex to mean male or female. They're talking about your biological body type, all right? But if you go look at most applications today, and most of us now say gender instead of the word sex, they use it as a substitute for the word sex, and that's how most people commonly look at the word. But I want us to see that gender has multiple meaning as a term, and it has many contradictions in terms of meaning, but it has a very particular function within feminist thought. And that gender as a term, when you move beyond just saying it means your body type, male or female, that it carries assumptions in terms of how men and women relate that are ingrained in that concept as a feminist defined concept. And then it begins with those assumptions to carry weight in terms of how we begin to talk about and see certain issues and certain things. The first proposition I want to make is that if we look at the meaning of gender beyond the definition of body type, and look at some of its other meaning, is the fact that it represents the Trojan horse of feminism. The Trojan horse of feminism. The function of a Trojan horse during a time of war is to do what? Infiltrate and surprise attack, where people are disarmed, are not even aware. And that is why the concept that Marimba Ani gives us in Urugu, a rhetorical ethic, becomes very important. Because what I want to look at today is some of the rhetorical strategies, some of the words, the concepts that they use to infiltrate our consciousness, even when we don't want to be feminists and we don't claim to be feminists, we think like feminists. And to be able to be aware of that, to uncover that, to demystify that, so that we can make conscious choices to negate its impact in terms of how we talk about ourselves and how we think about ourselves. So when I talk about gender as a Trojan horse, when we want to uncover, demystify, give ourselves the tools, what we're essentially trying to do is decenter the feminist definitions of these words, the feminist understandings of these words. So we want to uncover and discuss a number of the rhetorical strategies that are Trojan horses of feminist thought, which have rented space in our consciousness and actively interfere with our attempts to build knowledge about our female ancestors. Trojan horses of feminist thought, which have rented, all right, they don't pay rent, they occupy, they infiltrate our consciousness. And so as we try to build knowledge of our female ancestors, their purpose is at cross purpose with what we're trying to do. And it is important to be aware of that. Gender as a Trojan horse, when I say it has become one of the primary ways that feminists have shifted our thinking, consciously and unconsciously, one of the primary ways they have done that is through what I call the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. The Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. What that project is that if you look at most of the history books written about Black women post the 1980s, the majority of them have been written from a feminist perspective, where not only how they organize the information, which when I say feminist perspective, it carries implications for how the narrative is written, how the narrative is organized, but also the practice of labeling Queen Hatshepsut, of labeling Amy Jacques Garvey, of labeling Shirley Graham Du Bois, all of these women as feminists. And what is the practical implication? As Baba Kabone talked about looking for models, they have set their sights on the younger generation, the posterity that Greg talked about, speaking to posterity, our posterity. And so it is our obligation to equip our young to be able to decipher and to be able to understand the misinterpretation that these narratives represent. Because in claiming these female ancestors, by extension, they're rewriting all of African history. Because you cannot separate the women from the men. So although these narratives appear to be just focusing on gender, the woman, they have a particular way how the men are represented and the relationship of the male and female are represented in these narratives. One of the things the narratives do is write in such a way that men are always against women, that all the issues split neatly along gender lines, with men on one side and women on the other side. And most importantly, defining Black men as outsiders and redefining white women as insiders. All right, so that white women become the extension of ourselves in their narratives. So what is good for them as our representatives, as one of us, is supposed to be good for us. So that you hear this narrative now that we are 13 strong and growing in the United States Senate, 13 white women and growing. That since Kara Mosley Brown, Black people have not had a senator since the Reconstruction era. And Hillary and company and Kay from Texas do not represent our interests. But you're supposed to say, that's a woman. A victory for any woman is a victory for me. So they shift the dialogue so that they become insiders and Black men become the other, the enemy. The other in the classical sense that Marimba talks about how European culture has to create the cultural other. That which is separate, that which is distant, disconnected from you. So we see that when we talk about when I even say the words male and female relationships. Male and female relationship, for most of us, that conjures up one type of male-female relationship. And that's usually the male-female relationship that involves sexual relations, whether it's inside or outside the context of marriage. That is the bond that is between a man and female that may be severed, whether that's your boyfriend, your husband, whatever, in that kind of context. But most of the time we say male and female relationships, we don't think mother to son, father to daughter, brother to sister. So they create that male-female relationship we're most familiar as the paradigm. So when we talk about black men this and black men that, who are an extension of you, we no longer feel uncomfortable to say black men, A-S-H-I-T. Who is an extension of you. Black man is a dog. Black man, the whole works. That should sit wrongly with our spirit, because if we saw that as an extension of our spirit, as an extension of us, that is one of us. And the way we talk about it is it's innate as opposed to a production or a product of the social environment. So when we say black men and treat them as the cultural other, then they become the enemy. Now, it's no longer politically correct to call men the enemy, but that is the foundational thought of feminism. And it becomes important for us to understand that, because when they look at our movements, when they look at our organization, strong men become patriarchy. And the goal is to destroy patriarchy. So the goal becomes to destroy strong men. Because strong men have been defined as a threat. And that the only way that you can become a strong woman is to have a weak man. Because men are against you. And they split it along gender lines. All right? So they'll never say destroy black men. But that is what our language and our talk does. And one way to begin to shift that and to be able to become open, because some have had such negative experiences with some of our brothers who, when I say what I say, is not to say we're going to defend the indefensible. But what I say is not the men condoning that man, that everybody who is doing ma'at should be lined up against any person who acts against ma'at. So it is not your gender, but your character. It is the content of your ideals. It is what are you committed to. And so what focusing on gender has had us do is to put the physical over the spiritual essence, to negate spirit, to negate the connectedness of African people through spirit. That is not to say that African people would negate differences between men and women, that they would say we're just one big blob and differences doesn't matter. See, the Europeans have a problem with difference because different has to always be ranked based on what's more valuable and what's least valuable. But remember, I was saying earlier that difference in and of itself is not bad. It is the meaning, it is the function, and it is the value you attach to it that becomes the issue. So when you see difference, that doesn't automatically mean it has to relate in a hierarchical manner. And it doesn't always mean that you have to erase the difference to have sameness in order for it to have the same human worth or the same value as such. So I want to step back to the notion of the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. As Dr. Clark used to say, not only did they colonize Africa, but they colonized information about African people. So it is the colonization of the information about African womanhood that becomes a central battleground, a central site for us to rescue and reconstruct. So it is through these narratives, this proliferation of books, reference material, articles, journal articles, and it's a multimedia approach. You could go to movies, you could go on the internet, you can go through the radio. Most of what is represented to us is represented from a feminist perspective. And although they have represented themselves as co-victims, they are not. They have deep pockets, and they work in concert with the men of their class. They're economically elite, and they have one goal in mind, and that is to control and rule the world. It is this manifestation of this goal that has allowed us to be blinded in terms of how they represent men against women. When you go back to Marimba as a model for understanding the European mind, she told you they will go to a certain point, but they will stop at the point of self-destruction. And so you have European women who are hostile to European men. But let's reflect on history when they pulled back. When their nation was threatened, they pulled back. During the Civil War, before the Civil War, they had organized the quote-unquote women's movement, it was the white women's movement, to advocate for them to have the vote. But when their nation went to war, the North and the South, they ceased and desist that action and went to help with the survival of their nation. And once its future was secure, they then went back to what they were doing. And you see that at times of war over and over again. But then they tell you, no, it's not about putting race first, because even if y'all have liberation, the black man's still gonna oppress you, that you have to put your sisters first. And even that language was not accidental, because they shifted the discourse both ways. Remember I said how they made black men outsiders, so that when we start talking about our issues, who's the our? When we start saying when we say that, and I'm talking about black women, we begin to say that in the sense that we as women, us as women, and then them over there. All right. So that shift in the language is critical, because in part of how they began to construct themselves as co-victims is that they wanted to shift us off of using family terms with black men. So we would say brothers. They didn't want us to say brothers. But you see, they wanted the term sisters, use a family term for them. And they shifted our dialogue with black men on the level of politics. This is a sexual politics. And in politics, you have different interest groups vying for power. And so it becomes this notion, not that you black men are an extension of you, but that you have to form an alliance if he is going along with your agenda as you have said it, but the you becomes white women and you against them. But then they want to say they're your sisters. Why? Because family, for the most part, you don't divorce, you don't let go. That's a permanent connection. But political alliance, politics makes strange bedfellows. People you were with today, you're not necessarily with tomorrow. So that shift is significant, and we need to be aware of that. But one of the ways to begin to counteract that is when we're thinking about the notion of male and female, and we're making judgments about the relationship, and we're making judgments about how we should act and how we shouldn't act, that the relationship male-female should not be the paradigmatic. That maybe we should think about it in terms of our sons and our daughters. Would we say, and one of the things they wanted us to do is to begin to get into this comparative suffering analysis. I'm worse off than black men. And black men, no, I'm the endangered species. black woman. No, I got double jeopardy. I'm both woman and black. Well, no, I'm going to prison. So it would be like people who are terminally ill in a hospital arguing over whose terminal illness gonna kill them first. No, my cancer and my heart attack will take me out before your liver and your spleen. That is what we're doing. But you only do that if you see that as a separate group, not as an extension of yourself. When we say gender issues, who conceptualized that term? Women's issues. What is a woman's issue? I've been confused about that for a while. Rape, for example. What makes rape a women's issue? So Hillary Clinton is going to care more about my violation than Mario, than my father, than my brother, than Dr. Carruthers, than Dr. Thompson. That I am an extension of him. He feels any violation that I feel and vice versa. And so that is a collective community issue with the community moving against whoever does the indefensible, men and women. So what we want to do is move ourselves to a position of strength, that black women don't have to carry these issues on their shoulders alone, that we clear the space for righteous black men and black women to work together for anybody who acts against the interests of the black community. And that is whether you're male or female, because they have begun to put us in a position where, because that's your sister, she can act as foul and as ugly and as against you, but that's your sister, and she's not the enemy, it's the man. So it becomes important to identify how they have created terminology to begin to have us think like feminists, even as we consciously attempt to reject feminism. One of the ways they did it was create a host of substitute words to disarm. So instead of saying feminism, particularly in light of the historical rejection of that concept from black women, they become strategic. We know if we say feminism, that's like waving a red flag, and they will be conscious to protect themselves. So let us use other words to disarm and therefore accomplish what we want to accomplish anyway. So when people are talking about gender analysis from a woman-centered perspective, notion separate, gender analysis, woman-centered perspective, gender perspective, that becomes ways when you look at what people are actually saying, not the surface word, gender versus feminism, but look at what they actually say in terms of how they construct their narrative, how they frame the issue, how they characterize the problem. You see no substantive difference than those who wore the red flags and say gender, feminist, overtly. So it becomes important to be aware that the surface word change does not change the underlying way that the issue is talked about. And that becomes the backdoor way to perpetuate their ideal that is acting at cross purposes with our ideal. And that is to build knowledge of our ancestors and to reconstruct and rescue African history and African people. So that shift in thinking away from men versus women, men against women, is to begin to conceptualize the relationship as speaking about the fruits of your womb. Because every male, in whatever range of role or function he's in, came from an African woman's womb. So whether he is the son, the brother, the father, or the mate or the friend. So as we talk about the fruit of our womb and we talk about our sons and daughters and make that the primary or the paradigm from which we then make our generalization, we would begin to see a shift in how we're able to evaluate the things that are being proposed for us to take a look at. Another rhetorical strategy, if anyone's have ever had to deal with feminists, is this ability to multiply on the surface level what at the deep level never changes. So they will say, no, that's not one feminism, there's multiple feminism. So whenever you try to hold them accountable for the ways in which specifically that paradigm for understanding and making sense of reality is against us, they have a rhetorical strategy of saying, not my feminism. So any individual feminist that you're critiquing and your arguments are on point, she's gonna say, that's not my feminist, that's the feminist over there. That's the Marxist feminist. No, that's the academic feminist. No, I'm the black, Afrocentric, da-da-da-da feminist, or whatever. And so that it becomes a rhetorical strategy to begin to not be accountable for the ways in which that paradigm acts against us. Let me give you an example of how important ASCAC is to this analysis and to give the strength in the physical world that the ancestors are bringing forth to stand strong on this point, that many times that I give presentations about this notion, I'm met with extreme hostility. And those times I'm not met with extreme hostility, I'm met in the hallways very secretively by people saying, I don't know how you could take them on. Not that it's anything special about me, because I know who I'm standing strong on terms of their own people's shoulders, and I know I have a whole organization that gives me the strength to stand tall. But basically, feminists control the academy. And so people are like, you're committing career suicide. You will not get a job because you cannot talk about black women, African women, from a non-feminist perspective. So there is extreme pressure, and most women either, for career purposes, give into it, or they decide to just keep quiet. And in their silence, they feel like no one would notice that they're not, taking feminists on in a particular sense. But I went to a presentation in Atlanta of the biographer of Shirley Graham Du Bois. It's entitled, her biography is entitled Race Woman, The Many Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. And as you read that as you read the text, one of the things the author alludes to is the fact that Shirley Graham Du Bois was adamantly against feminism. Now he puts like a one-liner in it, but when you read the rest of the text, he constructs and he talks about her and calls her a feminist. Despite how she defined herself, and despite her very clear, she left lots of writings about her ideals. To take away from her the ability to determine for herself how she would be defined is not kosher. All right? So I asked him the question, you allude to the fact that she has writings that are very clear about her stance on feminism, but yet you discuss her and you label her as a feminist. Now, black women, like all people, are complex people. Hotep. Cute little kid. Are complex people. In other words, we hold a range of political ideals, we hold a range of political beliefs, we hold a range of political commitments just like everybody else. All right. So why did you feel the need to label her as a feminist? Well, he first starts off by saying that because she was a powerful, dynamic woman, and that epitomized what a feminist is. So naturally, I labeled her a feminist. So it becomes this notion, this ability to define that to be a feminist is to be a powerful, dynamic woman. To be a powerful, dynamic woman in a reciprocal way is to be a feminist. And that's what happens when people are doing research on women in Africa. We see their roles, we see their function, their power. Now, they won't touch that word feminist, but we, as academic writers, going to label them that because to be a powerful, dynamic woman. The ability, as Baba Nobles and others have said before, power is the ability to define reality and have others accept your definitions of reality as if they were their own. All right. So we're talking about power here. And I said, so when I said it is possible, not only is it possible, it is true that African women were powerful, dynamic, progressive women, and they were not feminists. The two are not simultaneous occurrences, and they don't have to be conflated. Why would you automatically label her in that way? And so he finally said, I'm dealing with the politics of knowledge production in the academy. That when you write a book, it is sent out to blind reviewers by the publisher, and they get to add their comments. And what whoever the reviewers were saying, you need gender, and she's a strong woman, and you need to call her feminist, blah, 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 blah. And he said, is that what I need to do to get it published? Then so be it. So we're talking about the ability to appropriate and misuse black women for other people, serving other people's purposes, serving other people's intention. And so our task becomes to create a cadre of people to begin to counter this seizure of black women. And it is a true appropriation, because this reason they want to define white women as co-victims, and it comes in a whole range of things. We weren't at the meeting, we weren't invited when they declared women a minority, so that they can have all the privileges, whatever those would be, of minority, affirmative action, whatever you go out and sweat for, and then people want to get to the head of the line for. All right. Women as a minority, who are they talking about? Because before that big declaration came about, African women were, and that's not who we are, but I'm talking about from the policy standpoint in this country, already defined as a minority. They were shifting the definition of white womanhood. White women as the minority, numerically the majority, but shifting the political definition of white women as co-victims and as minorities, so therefore they can go to the head of the gravy train. All right. So we need to be able to define us versus them, but the us has a whole new meaning. So we won't talk about women in general, because women in general becomes their way to be centered, to become the paradigmatic womanhood. We become the deviants of that paradigm, and then they become the ones who can appropriate selectively when they need to the experiences of other women. That you become a pawn to be pulled out as they need it. Not a pawn to work, but a pawn to go in their stories to claim shared victimhood. So that is why you see they are extremely well funded. I just saw a presentation funded by the Gates Foundation, and they're going all over the world. So when they go over the world, now we have known Americans to be altruistic, giving aid just to be giving aid. They have to be getting something out of it. So this big push, you have people like Jay Leno's wife, you have where they go into the Muslim countries, they go into African country, and they're collecting all these stories about their oppression. Because when you take white women and you break it down on them, it won't hold up. So they need your stories so they can be co-victims and therefore claim the things they intend to claim. The appropriation of your stories selectively. They don't want black women in feminism, no matter what they say, but they want the ability to say this is my story when they need to say it, and then when they don't need it any longer, you're cast aside. So when I talk about this Black Feminist Revisionist History Project, it's not just merely a notion that we're going to debate, was she a feminist, was she not a feminist, but the implication for our consciousness in terms of how we think about issues that affect us, how we construct a conversation, not even get to solution. So to show you some examples of this shift and how it disarms us to talk about things from our perspective and in ways that will empower us. Of course, most of you are familiar that in 1965, with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's publication, The Thesis of the Black Matriarchy. All right, this notion that it's not the Ma'afa, that it's not racism, not white supremacy, that is the problem. Black people, your problem, the reason you lag behind in terms of the big gap, socioeconomic gap, in terms of why you live in the abject poverty and why you have the problems you have, is because your women are too strong. Your women are too dominating. Your family is female dominated, et cetera, and insulting the strength and the centrality of Black women. But because of the centrality of the mother principle in the African community, there was an immediate defense mounted in terms of people critiquing and causing a great deal of response to the Daniel Patrick Moynihan thesis. Now we could debate the degree to which that was successful, because I do believe some of that thesis, you too strong, you too loud, has seeped into our consciousness. But we at least attempted to defend ourselves. And the problem is the translation of the story, so that when you talk to young women today and they hear the remnants, but they don't know the origins of the you too strong, you too domineering, you too this, you too that, they say it's because I have to be strong, domineering, this, because you're weak. So that notion of weak men, in order to have strong women, you must have weak men, is something we must attack and we must deal with. But they didn't stop there. That Black Matriarchy thesis, 1965, 25 years later, they flipped the script. In 1980, Bell Hooks' book, Black Women and Feminism, they began to put out the Black Patriarchy thesis, which is the complement of the Black Matriarchy thesis. Black woman, Black family, your problem is not the Ma'afa, your problem is not racism, your problem is not white supremacy. Your Black men are too domineering, too strong. Your organization are too male dominant. But by 25 years later, father had been removed from the house. That important relationship. Our mind had already shifted from not mother to son paradigm, not father to daughter paradigm. We had already shifted to the Black male female, him as the other. So how much of a defense did we mount in protection of our fathers, complementing the protection of our mother? They are both bookend theses, two sides of the same coin, shifting the blame to us for what the Ma'afa and what has happened to us at the hands of the European mind and the European plan to control and dominate the world and not give up that power. And because of that shift, that is a practical way in which we have been ill-equipped to deal with the same principle with the same objective, but a reinvention of its manifestation. It is the continuation of European domination under new agendas. And if you go back to Mama Marimba's book, she says at different historical moments, different institutions within Europe were moved to the forefront. So in the 60s, Black people united, it becomes, no, it's not racist class. And it's not race. We need to move away from all their categories and talk about ourselves as an African family. but they never sleep. It's not racist class. Okay, so we deal with that argument, and then once we're trying to mount past that, no, it's not that it's gender. No, it's not that it's you are homophobic. No, it's not that you all are biracial. They're gonna keep, they'll come up with something else. Because the goal is always to divide and conquer. And to stand on the shoulders of what Baba Noble said to us, the shifting of our thinking, to see that we belong to each other, to make that decision that we belong to each other, to make that decision to collectively deal with those who do the indefensible, regardless of their gender, becomes important. So gender as a term, as a Trojan horse of feminist thought, it becomes important to be aware of how it functions and how that function changes over time as needed, that it has multiple, like any symbol, it has a surface meaning, but it also has many different meanings, and it becomes important to be able to identify which ways it's being used and how that use may be at cross purposes in terms of our agenda and our objective. In conclusion, I would like to say that an organization like ASCAT represents a model for the African community. The ability to balance the male-female principle, the ability to integrate the elders and the youth. That many people think the academy is just theory, or that you're talking about ancient African past and that's not something we could do, but we do it every time we come together and when we're not together. So the ability to find models in our history to replicate and to duplicate becomes important in terms of what we're going to use as the frame of reference, in terms of discerning what is normal and what is not normal, what is typical and what is not typical. Because that assumption, whether you're conscious about it or not, shapes how you think and how you act. So if your assumption, my assumption, that African men are a manifestation of the divine spirit, a manifestation and extension of myself, when I find one that acts outside of my interest, you're the exception to the rule of the general goodness of African men, and we must deal with you. But many of us go into it saying that black men are innately pathological, sick versions of manhood, and that when you find somebody good, that is the exception to the general rule that most of them ain't no good. So that conscious way you frame issues, that you characterize issues, shapes how you respond to those issues. That equation shapes your solutions. The questions you ask become important. But more importantly, whose questions are you asking? Not just what are you asking, but whose questions are you asking? We had a student, a white student at Emory University, who was allowed to publish in the Student University paper, a paper basically arguing a traditional European thought, and that is based on test scores and a whole host of other European scholars' shoulders upon which this student was standing. Black people, African people are innately, intellectually inferior to white people. And that we have an innate propensity to commit crime, where he got his statistics off the internet. But the university allowed him to publish it because they are a place where they have free speech and academic ideals are allowed to be exchanged freely. But that was an attack on us, all right? So imagine if he was wanting to publish an article questioning the Jewish Holocaust. Do you think they would have allowed the free speech argument to say, well, feel free to publish that because we're exchanging intellectual ideals? And what the students did was call a forum, the students at Emory, and bring this white boy in front of them as though he was a king, and then he sat at the front while they challenged and talked about how he had hurt their feelings, et cetera, and so on. And some of them were ill-equipped to challenge him. Didn't have the tools to challenge him, which only made him feel more superior. Because one of the student president over at Emory, he wrote an article back. He was allowed to put an article in. And his basic argument was that looking at the statistics that you looked at, Asian people perform better than white people on these standardized tests. So therefore, you didn't look at that or whatever. But that in no way refutes the other stuff. Why are you saying that? That's not an effective defense. And in addition, when I showed the article to my students, them being properly trained social scientists at Negro colleges, they began to argue the content of his ideals. In other words, what black people did you look at? Did you look at the black people in the projects? You should go look at the black people in the suburbs. So they getting into a substantive debate, and I'm like, stop it. Do you understand what's on the table? It's indebatable. It is like someone saying, we're gonna have a debate on whether black people are human. It is a scientifically legitimate question that we should be able to put on the table. I don't know if they're human. You don't get into statistical arguments over such a question. I would say, what if I want to put on the table the question of whether, based on historical record, not something I'm making up out of my imagination, I don't know, but white people do devilish things, so I want to research, are white people the devil? I'm not saying they are, but I'm just saying the evidence seems to show that. Why don't we have a debate about that? So if you don't want that on the table, don't put on the table a debate about whether or not we're human or whether or not we're intelligent. So it is important to understand that at all of these important historical moments, at no point white women using that language of sister will their bond to black women ever transcend their bond to the fruit of their womb. That is not a hypothetical question of whether it would or would not. Just go to history, and it will tell you that it does not. We can go from example to example. We can look at the debate over whether or not to support the 15th Amendment. As you're aware, the 15th Amendment was the notion that no state would be allowed to use race or previous condition of servitude or color to deny black people the right to vote. All right. But what the 15th Amendment does not do is affirmatively, and the Constitution at no point affirmatively gives you the right to vote. So if you look at the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights or whatever, and you see you have an affirmative right to freedom of speech, you know this all theoretical, you know this all on paper. They're theoretically, because none of it has ever been manifest. And that is the importance of this whole debate, is the fact that it is an opportunity to see the hypocrisy, the gap between what they say and what they actually actualize. This is quote unquote democracy. America is not a democracy. But from its inception, only certain small limited class of people could vote. Wealthy white men were property. The vast majority were disenfranchised. White men who were poor, white women couldn't vote, immigrants couldn't vote. Of course we couldn't vote or whatever. And so while people are tearing up when they hear we the people and freedom and justice for all, the reality is they are not the model they proclaim themselves to be. And that the struggle for the vote is not a women's issue versus a men's issue, because the majority of men couldn't vote either. That the majority of men were similarly situated as the majority of women were. And so that in that struggle, that becomes an important moment, because that at that moment, when the notion of whether or not to support the 15th Amendment was on the table, white women did not want to support the 15th Amendment because they said it didn't benefit them in any way. Black women stood with black men and supported the 15th Amendment, even though it didn't use the word gender. They supported the 15th Amendment because of the entire oppression that black people were experiencing, and they felt that would be one tool that will be able to empower the black community as a whole to defend itself in some way. And that notion that only black men will be allowed to vote was a notion that we're connected, we belong to each other. That's not your individual vote, that's our collective vote. And at that point, we had a unity of consciousness such that there really was no choice to dispute over. Billy Bob and Billy Bob both had the same intent versus us. There was no split. So that becomes an important moment, because when you read the literature about it, when they talk about black women, they always classify us under that rubric of women's suffrage, as opposed to talking about the concerted effort that black people mounted together to collectively have political voice. And that concerted effort was a continued effort. So after white women got the vote in 1920, when they end the story about women's suffrage, and black men and black women both are disenfranchised, and they did not lift a finger to enfranchise black women. In other words, they never voted as a collective, and they never voted to help black women. We should not have confusion about who is us and who is them. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the relationship to male and female principle is like the relationship of your left eye to your right eye. You will have greater insight, greater depth of perception if you work together. And that there is no reason you should choose which is more valuable to you, the left eye or the right eye, because both together have their greater power. Hotep.
Told ya.